Hello everyone. We're now going to have a debate. My name's James Freed. I run the NHS Digital Academy. I suspect it was me Tom was referring discussions about CIO training to earlier. And I can tell we're going to have a really interesting back and forth over the next 50 minutes or so. We're going to run this in a very traditional way, if that's okay. So this house believes that the NHS should be using open source wherever possible. We are going to have an advocate, and we're going to have someone against. They're both going to have an opening address, no more than 10 minutes each. There's going to be a little bit of a back and fro between them, and then it's over to you guys, and I want you to challenge them. Ask the questions you have never had the opportunity to ask before. We are going to get into and under openness and its application in the NHS. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Vallance, who's the Department of Clinical Haematology Information Manager at Oxford University Hospital Foundation NHS Trust. Goodness me, we like our titles. As part of organisations is what I mean. Grant, your 10 minutes starts now.
This House believes that the NHS should use open source wherever possible. I'm an open source user and advocate in my day job, and I couldn't do what I do with no budget, no central support or whatever without free and open source software. But before we get into the specifics of this, some of you just might not know what is this thing called open source. Open source basically is a license or set of licenses that gives the users of software the ability to use the software in a particular way. If you want to understand it, there is a link in the slides to where there's the full definition. But there's basically three key elements of an open source license that is utterly critical for why I believe, and I think you should believe too, that the NHS should use open source software. The first of these things under these is free redistribution. A lot of software, as you know, when you come to buy, you have to pay for it, pay money. And you're not allowed to distribute to your friends, although many of you would have let your nan use this little piece of software or whatever, even though you paid for it so that your nan could do their little thing. So that's one of the key things about open source software is this free redistribution. There's no fee for you to give the software away. The second element that's really key is the source code. Now, most of you will know that in order for software to run, it needs to be turned into code that runs on the computer. Before you get that, you get the code, and there's a number of processes that goes through in order for that code for that software to be generated, right? Critical to that is the source code, the instructions that basically make the software. Why is that source code really important? It's important because if you've got it, you can study it. If you've got it, you can modify it. And if you can modify it, you can then customize it. There are other benefits too. So if you can see the source code, you can potentially see some any particular security issues. But I'll get to that as part of my advantages later. And the final of the elements is the derived works. It gives you the ability that you can take the code, you can study the code, you can give it away, but you can adapt it. You can make it yours. So you have a particular set of capabilities. But oh my goodness, wouldn't it be great if our piece of software could be adapted to do this little bit of extra thing? Well, if you've got open source software, you're allowed to. If you don't have open source software, you're at the whims of the supplier of that software, where you can go, please, pretty please, could you develop this thing for us? And they'll go, oh yeah, but it'll cost you, and how much? An arm and a leg. I mean, my hospital has a particular vendor for their EPR, and it's most definitely not open source. And we have to go hand and foot and pay sums of money to get bespoke development.
Grant, so sorry, do you want us to be moving your slides on?
Yes, please. So that's basically the nub of what open source software is. But you might think, is there any reason to take some of the thunder of my opponent? Right? Why not? Why not open source software? Well, you can see as the license structure, this stuff's free. But so why would I say, why not for cost? Well, the thing is, as my opponent is likely to say, free software or open source software is never free. The software, the license for running it might be. However, the implementation of the support network and all the rest of it is never free. And it could be the case that in certain little niche circumstances that it will be cheaper because of these ancillary costs and so forth to deploy the closed source software. So costs might be a reason why you might not go to open source, because the infrastructure around open source is a sum. Another reason why you might not want to use open source software is that the thing might not exist, and there might be a lovely proprietary solution that really solves your need really effectively and really efficiently. And then while you could do an open source solution, the costs for being able to do that development and implementation might be too much when somebody else has done the problem solved. And another reason why you might not want to do it is history. We've grown up in a period in terms of software and training where people are trained on certain closed source solutions like Microsoft Office, for example, where you have a huge amount of experience because this is what everybody has used all the time to solve their problems. And if you're going to change that kind of implementation, it's like that would be really difficult. There would be a lot of extra training where people are deeply familiar. And there are other reasons why you might not want to do open source software is the risk. If you're doing open source software, you're taking much more of the implementation and the delivery on yourself. And if it breaks, you fix it. Now, we've talked about earlier in the room that this is a real problem we have. If it's broken, we can't fix it. But in the mindset of our managers, you can, if you procure something, you can take the risk, you can minimize your risk, you can pay somebody, and if they don't deliver, you can sue them. And if you're risk averse, that might be a reason why you might not want to do open source software. But I think the whys, the next slide, hugely overcompensate for those downsides. And I come back to cost. Now, sure, in some circumstances, you might be able to get other things free. However, free is free. Now, again, it depends on your level, but you can't beat free in terms of cost. So, in my space, I'll use databases, relational database managers. If you use SQL Server, you have that capability, but you're spending tens of thousands of pounds on the SQL Server license. You could use Postgres, an open source alternative, which has the licensing cost of zero. Now, both systems have infrastructure around it that you need to be able to deploy it. But becomes really a no-brainer in my mind. Why would you spend an extra 10 or 20 or 30 grand on a SQL Server license when you can have pretty much the equivalent capability for zero cost? Okay. The next reason why I think open source software is so important is freedom. It gives us the freedom to solve our own problems. And if there's anything that's come from this room today, it's like we need the freedom to be able to solve our own problems in our own way and be responsive to our own needs. And I think that this is one of the great things around open source. It gives you the freedom to be able to solve our own problems. And the other thing I think is great about open source software is it helps us build a future. If we build on open source software, we can build those modules that Marcus was talking about. We can publish them so that anybody else can use. We can standardize. We don't have to keep repeating the same problems again and again and again, or solving them individually again and again and again. Okay? We can solve them once, we can release them to everybody else, and we can build a much better digital future in the NHS. And then finally, I think open source software, generally speaking, comes with much greater quality. Because you can see the code, you can inspect it. You can build your own test. If it's a closed source and you don't know what's going on, and this is not to say that there are no great technological closed source companies that don't build quality software. But if it's free, if it's open, you can check for yourself. You can review it. You can make sure that you can that this piece of software is great because you've got all the elements of it to test for yourself and verify that it's great. So, to conclude, I think if you look at all the great benefits of open source software, I think it's a no-brainer, as one of my colleagues said to me when I was saying I was going to debate this, that this House believes that the NHS should use open source software.
Thank you very much, Grant. And now speaking against, we've got Geoff Revill, who's the Chief Exec of Safe Space One Limited and Director of the Southwest Cybersecurity Cluster, and is based in Devon. Geoff, your 10 minutes start now. Geoff, your 10 minutes will start when your slides come up.
I think you keep moving them down. So I think it's all one slide deck, I believe. There you go. So as you move.
Yeah, sorry. Right. So this House believes the NHS should be using open source wherever possible, is the actual claim. And what I'm standing against today is the last two words, wherever possible. To me, it's not about wherever possible. Such thinking does not allow for the significant differences of when and how to apply open source versus proprietary. Context, timing with respect to your particular risk appetite, your needs and requirements, the maturity.
Have you got your mic on?
Oh.
Is he coming through?
He's not.
No.
Is that one there? Yeah. Am I okay now?
Yeah. If you turn around, we can just see if there's... No, it's off. So we'll just go like that.
I'll just press that. Oh, there we go.
Now you're on.
Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. So I can just get that back into place. Right, there we go. So it's about context, it's about risk, and it's about timing, your needs and requirements, and when they are manifesting, how long you need to manage them for. All of these things come into any serious decision-making process for digital. At the same time, I'm also going to admit, I don't believe there's a single commercial product out there that isn't using some level of open source today. They're all built on it somewhere, somehow. So I like you to think about the fact that open source is not about tech and it isn't about the source. It's a business model. It's a business model with business-related decisions. And it's a tool, just like any other tool. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Now, I accepted to take the against position on this debate because I've got direct strategic decision-making responsibility and experience that I can reflect on to explain my position. And I'm going to go through some of that experience in order to help put some of this position into context. So, yeah, I graduated with a computer science degree. I did a dissertation on AI and natural language, and then I spent 20 years in the embedded real-time marketplace. And spent a lot of time building up companies, building out commercial software, software development tools for software engineers. So I've served software engineers for a long time. I've helped them build out the baseline operating systems, and the companies I worked for were proprietary, but they also ended up buying in Linux and becoming Linux proponents too. And in fact, we sold both to the market because sometimes this was the right thing and sometimes that was the right thing, right? Different markets, different requirements, different risk appetites, different everything, frankly. Now, during that process, I ended up being acquired and then acquired again. I ended up in Silicon Valley, and we just bought 5 companies with 7 product lines, and I was brought over to mash them all together, which basically meant I had about 300 software engineers across the world in multiple teams from 5 different companies. So kind of like herding cats to try and get them to do what I wanted. I had 10 product managers to help me do that, and we had a field sales force of about 1,000 people and a turnover for my product lines, because it was about half the billion-dollar business we were in, was about $500 million. So quite serious challenges. And what was interesting in there was that within that context, some of those products were open source, some of those products were entirely proprietary, and some of them were a mix. And my job was to figure out, and by the way, some of these products competed. So I had to make some really interesting decisions about what stayed and what goed, what got end-of-lifed, what got built on, what got taken forward, and how that was going to happen. At the same time, I had 1,000 field salespeople globally selling into the medical market, the defense market, the industrial control market, all of these big markets, and we were dealing at the executive level of those organizations, and we went out and spoke to them about, what would you like to see us do? And some of them had their open source hats on, and some of them had their proprietary hats on. The bottom line was they wanted everything, and so does the market. So what was interesting, let me take one example out of that, was that, yeah, that was the wherever possible. Sorry, I'm not using my own slides here. Okay, so one of the interesting observations was I had 2 compilers in my portfolio, or 3 actually, but one we end of life very quickly. One was a really kick-ass C++ compiler, really good at generating small code, really good at generating very fast code, entirely proprietary. And the other was a whole team supporting GNU and C++ for our customers. Now, which one will we run forward with? Interestingly, one of the decisions I was looking at, an observation within this, was that the GNU C++ team was double the size of the proprietary team. They didn't write GNU C++, they were just maintaining it. And they were advocating for the functionality that they wanted to see in the next generation of this compiler. So I guess my first observation is beware of taking on open source as a strategic part of your asset set, because you'll be drawn into responsibilities you were not expecting. And what those responsibilities were in this case was actually a bunch of very good software engineers spending 80% of their time advocating within the GNU community to get the functionality they wanted into the next version of the product. Because it wasn't controlled by us, the NHS, or us, the open source user, unless you decided you want to fork it. But if you want to fork it, then that's a whole different ball game, right, in terms of management. Now, interestingly, within that, there was a standard that came along called Elf Dwarf. And what it allowed us to do was to actually build with one set of tools and deploy with another. So some of our customers wanted our really fast real-time operating system, and we built that using our DApp compiler because it made better code than the GNU one did. So it's great. But then what those customers wanted was to use GNU because they liked their GNU tools, because they were open source house. And that's what they loved. But the standard allowed us to build with one set of tools and deploy with another. So another simple observation is that standards can be really useful as buffers and defense mechanisms that are now allow you the flexibility to make decisions around open source versus proprietary. And that's the role for me for standards in there. Now, my next problem was related to the integrated development environment. Now, we bought 3 of these from multiple companies, and we had 3 software development teams that were kick-ass in terms of their capabilities. But every single one of them wanted to be the baseline for the next generation that we were building using the skills of all 3 teams. And what I knew, and what my engineering manager told me was, if you choose one of them, you're going to lose one or two of those teams. You're going to lose between a third and 2/3 of your software development team that you just acquired. Serious challenge that I had to face. The resolution was brought to me by one of my product managers who found that IBM had also been building development tools. Oh, okay, I'm running out of time. I've been far too slow. Sorry. They've been building development tools, and they open sourced their core baseline, and we brought that in, and we kept all of our software developers. My point being, again, business decision, but in this case, very much a political one we wanted to manage. The next thing was about the interface of the systems. That became very much a decision that needed to be proprietary, because we wanted our customers to desire our solution because of its differential functionality and the way in which we made the build process of software that much simpler than any other platform. That is a proprietary bit. We didn't want that IP in the market for shared by anybody, because that's part of our brand. And if your business is a brand-related thing, you're probably not going to want to open source that part of your solution set. Now, just as a useful generalization, I hope you might agree with this, what I generally found is that open source is bloody great for the plumbing of any software system that you're going to do. It's generally pretty poor for the user experience. And the reason for that is that, in general, a platform that's built for open source isn't maintained at the pace that the market wants it at, because it's a bunch of volunteers volunteering their time and arguing about, as I said, that double GNU-sized team, what should go into the next version. It's a much slower, costlier process. But when it comes to consolidation, where the market of software developers out there say, actually, that functionality, I don't want to build that again. Oh, God, no, I don't want to build another database, right? Don't need to do that. What I want to do is build the stuff that goes on top of the database, that makes it functional for my applications. That's what I'm excited about for my next job. That's why, generally, I find open source really good for the plumbing, because it's where software gets consolidated. I'll probably run out of time. I'll skip my other observations, because I think I've made most of my key points.
You have 30 seconds to wind up.
Okay. Just on the free thing, generally speaking, certainly our customers, when we were selling our product, whether they were open source or not, basically paid the same price. It's couched in different terms. How we packaged that pricing was very different. But actually, they all wanted the same thing. They wanted a product that enabled them to do something, and they wanted it maintained, and they wanted it serviced. And those things add up to the same amount of money, no matter how you package it up. So this idea of free, frankly, when it comes to the reality of products going to market, it doesn't work. Not really. It ends up the cost somewhere. It might be inside your own company, but the cost will be somewhere. You can't avoid those costs. They exist. And everybody taking on code bases need the product, the service, the maintenance, the direction. And they want that roadmap. They want to know where you're going. They want to know what's going on. And that roadmap thing can often be a problem with open source. You don't know where it's going to go next unless you're putting the team in to make sure that the roadmap goes where you want it to go for your needs. But I also say, what are the other observations? I spent 10 years in another company which was building against an open standard. Competitor was open source. What happened there in the marketplace was both of them built value add on top, made that the differential that then attracted customers to their version of that open standard implementation, because they wanted to see that, oh, you understand our needs better than the last person, you're ahead of the game. The open source guys were building stuff on top that was not in the open source space, planning to release it, honestly, Gov. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. And the commercial guy said, here's our roadmap. Bottom line was, same product pricing in the marketplace, just a different way of couching and productizing the solution. So, if there's a last, I'm going to skip that one because I don't want to go into that. So, if in conclusion you can vote against the wherever possible aspect of this motion, And I'd rather say be open-minded rather than be open source. I think that's a better approach to adoption of systems, software, and digital applications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm prepping you now. In a minute, our speakers are going to have the chance to do a brief response to one another, so I'm preparing you both. I'm going to come to Grant first, then I'm going to go to Geoff. No more than 5 minutes, but you can be a lot shorter if you want to. Feel free to make provocations and ask questions of one another. Then I'm coming to you guys, okay? So get your questions ready. Grant.
I probably should have been taking notes of my from my opponent to be able to pick up some points, but the one that kind of I think immediately rung is that the claim that open source is great for the plumbing but useless for the user experience. It very much depends on what you're trying to produce. At least with how I use open source software in my own role, we basically use the plumbing to create the relevant product, and we have implemented way better user experiences than the proprietary stuff that we have in our organisation. Compare, for example, our psychological medicine platform that Joe wrote compared to our EPR. Sure, they are slightly different, but the usability of our piece of software is lights out better than what the proprietary solution. So I'd take that point on that. There were some other ones, but that was the one that...
I'll rebut that one if I can. So, first of all, I didn't say it was useless. I just implied that, in general, open source in the market finds itself solving the plumbing problem 9 times out of 10, and not so much the user interface problem. But having said that, I think there's a very big difference between building a product for your in-house requirements and building a product for a market.
Yep, and on that we entirely agree.
And the scalability challenges of building for a market, even if that market is an internal market called the NHS, let's put it into that category for the moment because that's the nature of this debate, that's still a very large market with a wide range of differing opinions, as the previous panel with their left-handed drawer opener talked about, right? And being able to build for that market is a very different problem set than building for a group of users for a specific deployment in a specific case. If you want to build something for a specific set of users in a specific case, you can build the best UI in the world. Absolutely agree with that. If you decide to open source it because you don't care about the branding, the commercialized version, feel free, open source it. I'm not saying open source is wrong. I'm just saying it's not a wherever possible answer. That's what I'm arguing against.
Sure, and on that note, I conceded that very point. I said there are certain use cases where it might make sense not to use an open source product. But where I'm coming from and where I'm situated is somebody who sits within a clinical service who has found that our own central digital is not particularly responsive, let alone the market is particularly responsive to our own particular need. And we want to be able to solve the problems particularly for our administrative staff and for our clinicians to make our service better. And the crux about it is because there's such a thing as open source software, I can, with no internal budget for my particular service, create solutions that have literally saved hundreds and thousands of pounds. One example, because there's free and open source software, our DTU was running a very efficient way of maintaining their chemotherapy administration list. It was taking 2 administrators most of their time in order to keep that going. And they came to me and go, "Can you help us go a bit faster?" And I went, "Yeah, I can." Using open source software, I reduced that 2 administrators spending most of their time to something like, 20 seconds. And in another instance, for a psychological medicine team, again, no one was being able to meet their needs in terms of the manager of their service
Did at any point the requirements of your users require you to fork the database, open source database that you're using in terms of and change and edit the code base that was there? That's my point, right? Great for the plumbing.
I had to do a specific implementation of this particular one.
And I'm not denying that the open source has its role, as I tried to highlight. Sometimes it's brilliant, sometimes it's not. Right? Is it wherever possible? No. Is it appropriate sometimes? Yes. Generally speaking, what I tend to find, and I think one of the interesting ones is the Libra one, because I think that's probably a question you're going to come up to, so I won't steal the thunder from that yet. But when you get to the market and you have to manage the product at the market level, it becomes a product management problem in the way that open source enables and empowers developers, but you now need to be a product manager. And that's a very different problem set and a different commercial set of challenges. Commercial, whether it's internal cost commercial or external market commercial, ends up being the same thing. It's about can you build that code base to be manageable over the long term, provide the service that your market requires? Well, actually, those things are outside the purview of whether or not open source is exactly correct. Sometimes it's the right route, sometimes it's not the right route.
And I'm saying in the context of operational NHS services and in solving it, what we have found that in terms of cost, sustainability, that we can do it with open source, whereas if we had gone to try and procure precisely those kinds of solutions, we would have spent an inordinately greater sum.
Okay, so we're going to... We've got a lot of back and forth here, which is fantastic. That's what debates are all about, but I want to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. We've got a gentleman here.
So I think that central point you made about closed source being good for user experience, for front end. What we as clinicians find is we've got the clinical world where the UI is terrible, and then you step outside, we've got great apps on our phones and on our... So for me, there again, maybe it does come down to procurement, but there's a disconnect here that the market isn't really working for the frontline users in healthcare software, and I felt you didn't really address particularly the challenges in healthcare with regards to closed versus open source. So why doesn't closed source give us good user interfaces in healthcare? What's going wrong there?
Geoff.
So is open source giving you good user experience in that context?
Well, so what
or do you have any examples of open source at the user level?
No,
okay.
So what
open source, Open Pancreas, some of the best.
Open Eyes is another one. For example, it's the leading, effectively, EPR in ophthalmology. Well, it was. It was. At least it was at one point. Maybe not now, but it was, and it did.
Well, which is quite often the case, by the way. Sometimes things start inside the commercial space, and then they go, I don't want to maintain this anymore. But some of the market wants it. Open source, brilliant tool for giving the market the control and access it needs. Sometimes it goes the other way round.
Sure.
Far less likely, but does happen. But to come back to your question, I think, which is just sort of, we got off topic quite quickly. I suspect, and I don't know the answer to this, but I suspect that a large part of the problem is the procurement model, which you kind of hinted at, and the lack of sophistication of understanding that certain levels of acceptability criteria need to be set. And perhaps I would suggest that actually proven efficiency versus current process is actually the measurable goal that should happen before wide-scale deployment. Now, as an innovator, I've been through trying to get into the NHS with some of the technology that we're building, and they actually do raise quite high bars for some of that stuff, but the way they ask the questions don't lead to good user experience. The way they answer the question is about show me that my process could be better. Well, I can always show you it might be better. Prove to me that it has been before I buy your product. That's a different procurement strategy, right? And I haven't seen that happening. So I guess that could be part of the reason.
So, Geoff, would you say, before I bring Grant in, would you say that the way in which, maybe not closed technologies as opposed to open technologies, but the accoutrement that around closed technologies, in the NHS in particular, are the reason why perhaps they're not achieving that user experience that you might expect in other industries? The procurement
I think
issues.
it's about closed or open in that context. I just think that it's about the sophistication of the procurement process and an inability to measure the things that matter.
Grant?
I mean, in some senses, it comes down to which model is more likely to be able to give you the capabilities to be able to iterate quickly and to make changes. Now, I will concede that there are really good closed source proprietary companies, no doubt like the ones that you led, that were very responsive to their users, would deliver fantastic value, and they're all happy. My own experience from within the NHS suggests that the closed source companies, particularly the big multi-billion pound ones, are most definitely not. You don't have the freedom to iterate, to make the changes, and indeed you can even have significant trust level things that this is a real problem, but they won't solve it for you. Or they say, oh, pay another 10, 20, 30 million and we'll make it happen. The ability with having built on an open source and open foundation, it goes, well, in an ideal situation, what you would have is all the openness, and then you'd be able to hand it over to a really good company to help maintain and support. And you're right, you would pay pretty much exactly the same, because the market inputs
It depends on the market whether or not you would pay the same. But actually, I suspect the NHS would pay more. Talk about that for a second.
But the point I'm getting at is that if it's built on open, if those things break down, and you have been running the software yourself through normal processes, if things break down, you can take back control. And I know the point you're going to come back about
no, you don't.
escrow and all the rest of it.
You don't, actually, because I'm going to give you a counterpoint to that particular argument.
No.
So one of the things that we did when I was working for 10 years for this other company, and it was about meeting a standard called data distribution service. It was about building systems through the data and architecting systems of systems through data definition. And there was an open standard for that. And we were a commercial provider, and our primary competitor was an open source provider. And our biggest customer was the US DoD, and the defense market was generally our biggest customer globally, but actually the health market's growing fast, the Internet of Things, industrial control, a lot of others are growing very fast. This was a few years ago. Now, our open source competitor would put out this argument exactly as you just laid it out. And interestingly, to some extent, the US DoD procurement department had bought into it. Because whether you were open source or not, if you were a provider of systems and software to the DoD, you had to give them your source code, either in open source or in escrow. So one way or another, you can always get access to the source. And if you're a big procurer like the NHS, you could do that, right? You could actually require access to that code base. No problem. So then we did a little study, and we went back to the DoD and we said, okay, for that code base that you got from company X that's become defunct but you want to maintain, or the company's gone under and you want to continue looking after it, whatever your service model requirement is, how often have you actually actioned that capability? I don't care if it's open source or escrow. How many times have you actually actioned that? And we got a list of projects that did that. How many of them successfully concluded, but to bring in a new set of software engineers to manage a code base that they didn't develop? You know the answer? Zero.
Yeah.
This was the biggest procurement organization in the world. Zero. The point that we made was that code and systems development is like yin and yang. If you separate developers from the code base, you have an unmaintainable code base. Open source expands that potential to maintain it, doesn't guarantee it.
No.
So then the DoD had to go to the open source market, where they had open source, and say, can you maintain this for us? And they go, well, what do you want done with it? Well, we want it just looked after. Oh, I'm bored with that. I'm moving on to the next phase of the product. You know? So they had to then pay the exact same amount of money, whether they would escrowed or anything else, in order to maintain that freedom of access to the source. Bottom line was, I'm afraid it was rubbish.
Thank
the
you.
NHS, it would be rubbish too.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on. We're running out of time, so just so you know, Geoff, I'm not going to get to my question on Libra versus Office. But if you can shoehorn that into the whatever
Into the answers, we all see what
whatever
we
comes
can do.
next,
Yeah,
that'd
yeah.
be awesome. Your question.
I guess what's the crux of the problem? You know, is it that the fact that we need interoperable standards? Because one reason why we want things to be all open source is that we don't end up shoehorned into having to use one product, and if it goes down, you know, nobody can do anything with anything. Whereas if you have open standards, you can still like piggyback a bit, and even if the program doesn't do one thing, there's still the capability to somehow work around it. So is that actually, you know, the core problem? Obviously, it doesn't apply to everything in the sense that if you have your data analytics department,
The answer, yes, you're right on.
the problem between having to use SPSX versus R is quite a different story. But for general healthcare needs, you know, is it the interoperability question rather than anything else?
Interoperability question, absolutely. So go back to the DoD as an example of a sector that's addressed the problems the NHS are facing. And about 20 years ago, because they're about 20 years ahead of the NHS, at least, possibly 25, in terms of thinking about this problem space. And they basically made interoperability of systems a KPI. And they went through multiple phases of trying to build that into procurement processes. They went into fixed and open standards for various different parts of the systems. Right? And that solved a few problems and it reduced some costs, and that was great. But actually, it didn't solve the fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem was that they didn't control the data model. And worse than that, the data model ultimately is not interoperable unless the semantics of the interpretation of it is a part of the data model itself. Correct. And that was the big discovery, aha moment that the DoD had. And what they recognized was that when you're talking about very large scale systems of systems, lots of systems talking to lots of systems, if you have a syntactic data model, which is what all of the NHS models currently are, then every single developer accessing and using that model has to go and read a document that tells them how to interpret the model. That means the semantics of the interpretation is written into the code, which basically means if he makes a mistake and she makes a mistake, may not get spotted at first, but when you get to two systems talking to each other, and that turns into 20, and then you get to 100, and then you get to 80,000, which is what the NHS could be talking about, and you put that to the power of n, because all 80,000 could be talking to all 80,000, that's a very big number, don't know what it is, then those small errors become virtually intractable in terms of finding them and solving them. What they determined was that actually if you put into the data model in a form that was both forwards capable and backwards compatible, that you could then build systems. And then the procurement department, who's very sophisticated, mandated that, and they took the data models away from their providers, and they just become the people that operate on the information set. But the guarantee of semantic interpretation of the data model was then delivered. Bingo. That's what interoperability is all about. And I ran an event helping them to build out that model called Interoperable Open Architecture, and it took me 7 years to get the market to buy into the process, because of course, where do they make their money? Integration.
Thank you. Grant, are we going to move on if that's okay? We've got our last point that Marcus is going to make, and then I'm going to ask for a quick sum, and we are going to do a vote, ladies and gents. So, Marcus.
Okay, well, I was going to retort to what you were saying.
Can you turn
Do you want to turn on the mic?
I was going to retort to that.
Not on.
working.
Sorry. Is it?
It's switched on. Do I need to be...
Hey, somebody else.
Yeah, number 7.
Now it's going. I can hear it. Was.
Yeah, that's...
We're just going to use this, Marcus.
I think it's on there.
Oh, it's on.
A very quick point about what you were just saying, which is what you're entirely correct that nightmare of standards problems does occur, but it's a very strong argument for having a single open source implementation that has the entire data stack, the data model, the semantics of it, and share that with all the people who are implementing it. and then you take away the need for that to be re-implemented again and again. And a very good example of that is which companies are building their own SSL stack for HTTPS? Nobody. They all use OpenSSL.
Okay, we need a
because
response.
it's there.
Jeff?
Lovely plumbing. Agree.
So but it is plumbing. Well, the thing you were talking about was plumbing.
Okay, so to come back to your point, so the interpretation of the model, what you're saying is put it into the code, not into the data model.
Build a stack that has the data model in it, the entire commodity layer
But that requires you to understand the ability of any system that hasn't yet been innovated, that hasn't been designed, for which a requirement doesn't currently exist, for your API to service that functionality. And what the DoD discovered was you couldn't do it that way either, right? If you put it into the data, then the service level functionality, whatever you want, Gov, right? Build it yourself. You put it into the code, you've had to maintain and build that code base to provide the services to the service user that meets their requirements. And maybe it does and maybe it doesn't, because you think you've figured out all the possible permutations of use of that data. Guarantee you will not. Guarantee you will not.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. A quick applause before we ask for summaries. Grant, if I could ask you to come to the front. I'm going to have Geoff on my right. I'm going to have Grant on my left. This is not being choreographed. I'm making this up on the fly. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to support your case, literally no more. Why should people vote for the motion, Grant?
I believe people should vote for the motion because the pain that we all experience in this room is we can't solve our own problems our own way and to meet our own needs. And with open source software, we have the freedom and if we build the capability, the capacity to do so.
Thank you. And Geoff, why should people not vote for the motion, vote against the motion?
Because wherever possible is an inappropriate mindset for whether or not you should or shouldn't use open source. You should be open-minded. It's got great assets, great benefits, but so does commercial. And there's a balancing act and a context for every decision. And as a consequence, forcing yourself down a wherever possible road is a very bad idea. Keep it open. Stay open-minded.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry for those of you online. I'm not going to be counting your votes. It's only going to be in the room. And a show of hands now, please, for the motion. And against. You know what? I can't call that. This house is undecided, ladies and gentlemen. There we go. Thank you very much. Have a great lunch.